The year is 2024 and people are still playing defense for the losers of the Second World War. I'm talking about Zoomer Historian, a relatively new history channel of about 60,000 subscribers, which is completely devoted to defending Germany in the Second World War. Now, he doesn't directly defend the worst acts committed by Germany. Instead, he either ignores them, downplays them, or exaggerates bad things someone else did instead. Well, at least publicly. Now, to any fans of Zoomer Historian, he's just wrong. I'll show you how. I'm not a communist. I don't hate you. I don't hate Germany. What I don't like is dishonesty. But what are my qualifications? Because I'm not just a random guy. I have a master's in history. But you know what? Don't trust me. Trust my sources, which I will cite and link below. You can read them. If you are an honest person, you must be willing to have your beliefs questioned. I watched this guy's entire YouTube channel for this video. If you're an honest person, you must be willing to change your beliefs if new evidence comes to light. And if you don't agree with Zoomer Historian, that is good for you. But why don't you still watch the video? More people than just me need to push back against his deception. And maybe you'll learn a thing or two. Zoomer Historian says he is non-political. He cites books, so I'm not going to be petty. I'm going to treat these videos as actual essays and debunk them using actual historical sources, including primary documents, some of which were created by the leaders of Germany themselves. Because Germany documented the acts of mass murder it committed, the bloodshed wasn't peripheral, it was central. A common counter, especially from Zoomer Historian, is that history isn't so black and white, and that Germans weren't Hollywood villains. A charitable interpretation of that kind of argument is Zoomer Historian is simply naive. Today in the Western world, or at least Britain since he's British, the idea of such mass murder is inconceivable. It seems implausible, but evil can and has been done in the world. Do I think that there is something uniquely evil about Germans? Something inherent to them, something in their blood? Obviously not. But this mass murder didn't just come from nowhere. Germans were whipped into a frenzy of hate by the humiliation and trauma of the First World War, by generations of anti-Semitic propaganda, by envy and hatred for the other, by dehumanization and social pressure, and by, of course, the German government, which produced ceaseless propaganda and which gave the orders to carry out this mass murder. But Germany didn't invent genocide. It certainly was not the last to carry it out. And that's why, throughout this video, I'm going to avoid using German terms when English translations exist, because I don't want to exoticize. The lesson we can take from this bloodshed is how to avoid such a thing again. You can only learn from history if you admit it happened and understand how it happened. Alright, one last note before I end this intro and get into the video. I'm obviously not saying certain words that YouTube finds offensive. In case this video gets demonetized anyways, how about you subscribe and check out my Patreon. Anyways, there are 3 types of videos he makes. 1. How Germany wasn't actually that bad. 2. How everybody else was actually worse. And 3. Detailed histories of the German leaders and government which conveniently shrug off any wrongdoing and fail to mention the worst crimes committed by them, even when they're directly relevant to the subject of the video. For example, he has a video on Germany's plans for Russia that purposefully failed to mention Germany's campaigns of mass murder, which are the most documented war crimes in human history. The violence inflicted by Germany and its allies, again, was not random. It was part of a plan of annihilation that originated at the very top of the German government. Zoomer Historian also has an hour-long history, the complete history of the SS, that shrugs off the immense quantity of murder carried out by that group by pinning anything bad it did on just one bad apple brigade. That's his most popular video with over 200,000 views. Now listen, you don't have to make a video about everything bad Germany did. You can make videos about the politics and personalities of World War II Germany. You can have a 4-hour-long biography on Hermann Göring. That's fine. And if any comment says that I argue anything different, they probably stopped listening a while ago about when I said the death camps were real. But when you purposefully failed to mention the crimes against humanity that these men carried out, even in the videos about them, it's pretty clear what the purpose of your channel is. Zoomer Historian's goal is to present a sanitized, romanticized, and false history of mass murder, to lie by omission, to downplay, to shrug off. For anybody who likes this guy, consider this. There are videos about the history of the Soviet Union that conveniently failed to mention all the horrible things Lenin, Stalin, and their successors did, and there's plenty of blood on their hands. If those apologists do mention their crimes, they're always the fault of the enemy, or of unblameable anonymous people, or of one or two bad apples. That's bad history, just like Zoomer Historian. Here's another example. What if someone made a video about the complete history of Ted Bundy and didn't mention that he killed anyone? But alright, let's move on to an actual video. Let's look to Zoomer Historian's What Were Hitler's Plans in the East? Zoomer Historian says that his aim is to counter a myth that Hitler wanted to kill all Slavic people in Eastern Europe and settle Germans there. Well, he admits that they did want to settle Germans there, but the first part he disagrees with. After talking about how people in Western Europe held racist views against Slavic people, just like Germany, he says,
"With all that being said, Hitler didn't hate Slavs or Eastern Europeans in general, but it's true that he did see them as inferior. The claim is never that he just saw these people as inferior, however. The claim is that he wanted to kill them. It's hard to know where to start with such a claim when no evidence exists to support it. Hitler's role in the party had often been one of a restraining force, rather than the mastermind of evil schemes or radical new ideas. First it was the SA, and then later the SS, with the more crazy ideas or theories."
Okay, so this whole theory comes from the crackpot historian David Irving, who you can make a whole documentary about. Actually, they made a movie about him. But let's start with the first claim. Hitler didn't hate Slavs. Is that true? Obviously not. Let's look to Mein Kampf, where Hitler writes this about his years in Vienna. "I was repelled by the conglomeration of races which the capital showed me, repelled by this whole mixture of Czechs, Poles, Hungarians, Ruthenians, Serbs, and Croats, and everywhere the eternal mushroom of humanity, Jews and more Jews. To me, the giant city seemed the embodiment of racial desecration. The longer I lived in this city, the more my hatred grew for the foreign mixture of peoples which had begun to corrode this old site of German culture." Notice how he says hate right there. Earlier, Hitler wrote himself that, "In this period there took shape within me a world picture and a philosophy which became the granite foundation of all my acts." Zoomer Historian later says that it's silly to cite Mein Kampf. Very convenient for him because Hitler outlines his whole ideology in that book before he had the responsibility of conducting Germany's foreign relations with the Soviet Union, who he allied with for a little bit. So, did Hitler hate the Slavs? Yes, obviously. The next claim is that Hitler didn't want to kill the Slavs. Well, he certainly ordered his government to kill a whole bunch. Soon after taking control of Poland, for example, Germany began to massacre the educated ruling class of Poland with a large prepared list of names called the Special Prosecution Book Poland. There's a whole book on this called Poland's Holocaust. We'll talk more about the details of Germany's rampage in Eastern Europe later, but here's a little juicy bit. Back on October 2nd, 1940, Hitler was having a dinner with a couple high-ranking officials in German-ruled Poland. A report of that conversation provides some insight into what Hitler wanted. Over his dinner, the Führer said, "It is indispensable to keep in mind that there must be no Polish landowners." You can translate that a couple different ways, but you get the idea. "However cruel this may sound, wherever they are, they must be exterminated. Of course, there must be no mixing of blood with the Poles." He goes on to say, "There should be only one master for the Poles, the Germans. Two masters side by side cannot exist. All representatives of the Polish intelligentsia are to be exterminated. This sounds cruel, but such is the law of life." I've linked this document below, but it is one of many, many documents of Hitler and other people in the German government discussing what people like Zoomer Historian and the historian David Irving deny was a purposeful policy of genocide that Germany implemented in Eastern Europe. It's hard to get an exact number, but including both Jewish and non-Jewish Poles, Germany murdered roughly 5 million people. Zoomer Historian makes no mention of this in any of his videos, but let's let him further develop his argument.
All theories of what the Germans were planning to do in Eastern Europe rest on absolutely no evidence on Hitler's part. For example, charts like this found on Wikipedia have absolutely no foundation in reality. This particular one is one of the most widely believed. The idea that the Germans, the second the war ended, were going to deport or kill 50% of the Latvian and Estonian population when they currently had over 100,000 of them fighting for the SS is beyond comedy. It sounds like something out of a Marvel movie or Star Wars, as opposed to anything based in reality. But what were these theories from others that such claims are based on? Like I said, there was no official policy, so you had all sorts of ideas going around. On the one hand, you had the outright evil views of some men working in the racial office. On the other, you had extremely prominent figures such as Rosenberg, the Reich Minister for the occupied Eastern Territories, and Leon de Grael, the Walloon SS leader who argued for autonomy and independence for the occupied peoples in the East. Let's begin with the evil. The most striking example is from a Dr. Erhard Wetzel, who worked for Rosenberg. The letter is dated April the 27th, 1942.
Okay, since this quote is going on a little long, I'll just paraphrase what comes next. Zoomer Historian presents two quotes from actual German leaders at the time. Dr. Erhard Wetzel, who worked for Rosenberg and advocated for voluntary, that's in quotation marks, sterilization and population control for Russians, and Leon de Grael, who in the 1990s expressed admiration for Russian people to a Russian fascist named Alexander Dugin. As evidence that Hitler agrees with de Grael, Zoomer Historian presents the biggest smoking gun of all time. Hitler said that if he ever had a son, he wished it was like de Grael. So is Zoomer Historian right? Obviously not. The beliefs of two men who are far from the heights of power is not evidence for the policy of the entire German government, even if Hitler once said that he liked one of them, and even if one of them said that he liked Russians 40 years after Hitler died. So we talked about Poland, but what about the Soviet Union? What was Germany's actual plan for Eastern Europe? Well, let's start at the beginning. In Mein Kampf, Hitler had this to say about his plans for the East. We National Socialists break off the colonial and commercial policy of the pre-war period and shift to the soil policy of the future. If we speak of soil in Europe today, we can primarily have in mind only Russia and her vassal border states. The Persian Empire in the East, that's Russia, is ripe for collapse, and the end of Jewish rule in Russia will also be the end of Russia as a state. Our task, the mission of the National Socialist movement, is to bring our own people to such a political insight that they will not see their future in the breathtaking sensation of a new Alexander's conquest, but in the industrial work of the German plow, to which the sword need only give soil. Okay, so from the start, Hitler wanted to conquer Eastern Europe, not for the breathtaking sensation of conquest, but for colonization. But Zoomer Historian also agrees that Germany wanted to colonize Eastern Europe, so let's fast forward to January 1940. It was then that Konrad Mayer, an SS officer assigned the task of planning the future of Eastern Europe by Heinrich Himmler, that's a pretty high-ranking Nazi by the way, created the very plans that Zoomer Historian doesn't believe exist. General Plan Ost, or the Master Plan for the East. As historian Timothy Snyder talks about in Bloodlands, which is a great book, there were a couple different versions of the plan drafted between January 1940 and May 1942, and they kind of focused on different issues. The one that discussed, the actual violent plan, in most detail was destroyed by Germany, go figure. They did not destroy a letter, though, discussing in detail the plan, written by Erhard Wetzel, an official working for Rosenberg as an advisor on what Germany should do with non-German people. Wait a minute. That name sounds familiar. If you find the letter where Wetzel discusses the master plan for the East, he eventually starts talking about how Germany can sterilize Russians. Zoomer Historian literally reads from that letter in his video. You can Google the document yourself. It's called, in part of my German, Stellungnahme und Gedanken zum Generalplan Ost des Reichsführer SS, or in English, Statement and Thoughts on the General Plan East of the Reichsführer SS. I also put a link in the description of 2 journal articles that quote from the document. Okay, so what's this document again? On April 27, 1942, Wetzel wrote that as early as November 1941, the plan was to deport 31 million foreign nationals from German-ruled land in Eastern Europe. For anyone familiar with the bureaucratic innuendos used by the Nazis, final solution, liquidation, so on, deport might sound like another term for murder. And it was, kind of. The Germans wanted to literally relocate the populations of Eastern Europe to Siberia, beyond the Ural Mountains. You can imagine how that would look if it was implemented. Packed cattle cars, death marches, mass famine, the stuff Germany did in real life, actually. Lots of people died that way before Germany was defeated. This isn't an opinion by Wetzel, he is discussing an already established plan and commenting on that plan. I'll take a brief second to refer to the Wannsee Conference Protocol, a captured document that shows the plan for the extermination of Jewish people. The document, in the beginning part recounting the history of Germany's anti-Semitic policies, recounts that Nazi Germany first sought to deport its Jewish population. It then says The Reichsführer SS and Chief of German Police had prohibited immigration of Jews due to the dangers of an emigration in wartime and due to the possibilities of the East. Another solution to the problem had now taken the place of immigration, i.e. the evacuation of the Jews to the East. What does evacuation mean? Because the document uses the term evacuation over and over. In his speech the next year to SS officers in Posen, Himmler said what evacuation actually meant for the Jews. I'm currently talking about the evacuation of the Jews, the extermination of the Jewish people. It's one of those things that's easily said. The Jewish people are being exterminated. You can Google this yourself, there's literally a recording. Okay, so pretty clear precedent for Germany giving up on deportation and switching to mass murder. That transitions us back to the Slavs of Eastern Europe. So, what does Wetzel say about the master plan made for the SS, which was given extensive authority in Eastern Europe? Well, Germany was obviously confronted by the lack of available colonists to settle the East, and the challenge of deporting the entire local population of whole countries despite its industrial capacity. So they planned to evaluate who among the conquered people could be Germanized, and the rest of course would be deported to Siberia beyond the Ural Mountains. As Wetzel puts to paper, 80 to 85% of Polish people, or about 20 million people, were to be deported to Siberia. Why were the Poles so far from Siberia set to be deported? Well, Wetzel writes that they couldn't be relocated to the Americas, and that it is obvious that the Polish question cannot be solved by liquidating the Poles like the Jews. Such a solution to the Polish question would burden the German people well into the distant future and deprive us of sympathy everywhere, especially since the other neighboring peoples would also have to expect to be treated similarly in due course. So, deportation to Siberia instead. He also presents other percentages of people set to be deported to Siberia, including 65% of Western Ukrainians, 75% of Belarusians, so on. Then he begins discussing Russians, which is where Zoomer Historian begins to quote. Because remember, he reads this letter in his video, except obviously he doesn't read all of it because he skipped over the most important part. For 6 minutes he quotes Wetzel's thoughts on encouraging the sterilization of Russians to reduce their numbers, including refusing to address infant mortality. Now, Zoomer Historian admits this is pretty bad, but he had to scroll past the entire section of forced deportations to Siberia to get there. He literally uses the document that proves the existence of Germany's plan for ethnic cleansing to argue that they did not plan to ethnically cleanse Eastern Europe. This is obvious dishonesty, and nobody calls him out on it because, admittedly, this is pretty esoteric history. At the end of the video, he literally challenges people to find a document to prove him wrong. He found it himself. Right after he stops speaking, by the way, there's a section that says 50% of Czech people would have to be deported from German-ruled territory. Like, there's not a break. It's right there. Dr. Wetzel closes out his letter by making the following statement. If the Third Reich is to be 1,000 years old, the planning for it must also be made for generations. This means, however, that racial biological thinking will have to be of decisive importance in future German politics. Only then will we be able to secure the future of our people. I think that's a perfect indication as to why German bureaucrats were thinking about this. It was their ideology. So Zoomer Historian is right. The plan was not set in stone. It wasn't just to shoot them all on sight, but it's pretty clear that the idea was to kill, enslave, or deport as many people as they humanly or inhumanly could. While Wetzel quotes the broader plan that was produced for the SS, are there any quotes from anyone higher up to actually reflect this? What plans do we know existed from before June 22nd, 1941? Well, even if we don't look at the actions of the SS just yet, it's pretty clear that Himmler agreed with this. According to post-war confessions, the leaders of the SS met June 12th to 15th to discuss the coming war. Himmler reportedly stated, "It is a question of existence. Thus it will be a racial struggle of pitiless severity in the course of which 20 to 30 million Slavs and Jews will perish through military actions and crisis of food supply." Franz Halder, the chief of the General Staff of Army High Command, that's pretty high ranking, took notes in a meeting presided by Hitler. The orders issued by Hitler, the Commissar Order, reads, "The war against Russia will be such that it cannot be conducted in a knightly fashion. This struggle is one of ideologies and racial differences and will have to be conducted with unprecedented, unmerciful, and unrelenting harshness. All officers will have to rid themselves of obsolete ideologies. I know that the necessity for such means of waging war is beyond the comprehension of you generals, but I insist absolutely that my orders be executed without contradiction. The commissars are the bearers of ideologies directly opposed to National Socialism. Therefore, the commissars will be liquidated. German soldiers guilty of breaking international law will be excused. Russia has not participated in the Hague Convention and therefore has no rights under it. You can find this quote in The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich on page 830 and in a bunch of other places too. A similar version was ultimately issued to soldiers in June 1941. Hitler made similar calls for brutality, including on June 14th, soon before the invasion. You'd have to be completely ignorant of the history of National Socialism to not understand what Hitler was talking about, because, as was usual, Hitler made grand orders while his underlings interpreted those orders into practical policies. Back in May, the high-ranking General Wilhelm Keitel issued the following orders in the name of Hitler. Persons suspected of criminal action will be brought at once before an officer. This officer will decide whether they are to be shot. With regard to offensives committed against enemy civilians by members of the German army, prosecution is not obligatory, even where the deed is at the same time a military crime or offense. So that was basically a blanket order that officers could just kill whoever they wanted. Keitel also gave Himmler leeway to implement whatever plans he had, which, as we know, including the deportation of millions of people. Besides obviously agreeing with the ethnic cleansing scheme, Minister of the East Alfred Rosenberg, who Zoomer historian practically casts as a liberal, states around this time that we see absolutely no reason for any obligation on our part to feed also the Russian people with the products of Ukraine. We know that this is a harsh necessity, bare of any feelings. Was this an actual plan to starve Russia by seizing the agricultural products of Ukraine for Germany? Yes, it was. It's called the Hunger Plan. Göring, who was said to be in charge of the economy of conquered lands, issued a memorandum on the subject. Any attempt to save the population there from death by starvation by importing surpluses from the Black Soil Zone, that's Ukraine, would be at the expense of supplies to Europe. It would reduce Germany's staying power in the war and would undermine Germany's and Europe's power to resist the blockade. This must be clearly and absolutely understood. Did German officials know that this would kill millions of Russians by starvation? Yes, that was known in the government. For example, on May 2nd, before the war, a key logistical planning session concluded that, without a doubt, tens of millions of people would die from starvation. Again, this is called the Hunger Plan, you can look it up. So, the German government planned to brutalize and starve the Slavic people of Eastern Europe before Germany even invaded Russia, then soon formalized plans to deport most of them to Siberia. Later, Zoomer historian says,
the ironic thing about the obsession with Hitler's plans in the East is that the opposing side actually did them in reality. Much is made of Germany's genocidal plans in the East to colonize the area, especially in Russian propaganda.
Okay, we'll address Allied war crimes later, but here Zoomer historian is saying that Germany did not implement its plans for Eastern Europe. He's right. The Allies stopped Germany before it could. So what did the Nazis do to Eastern Europe? Well, the Commissar order that all resistant communist commissars were to be murdered without trial, and the other orders about just killing criminals on sight, were read by the men who invaded Eastern Europe to mean all Jewish people, who Hitler had spent a decade saying were communists, were to be murdered. That violence also included Slavic people, but they were not all murdered on sight. At a meeting between Hitler and Himmler, Himmler raised the question of the Jewish people, and he wrote in his diary to be exterminated as partisans. The people killed by Germany and its rebel allies were not just communist officials, not just partisans or plunderers, but civilians. Germany targeted Jewish civilians in particular. There are many reports of this mass murder in Eastern Europe produced by the men who carried it out themselves. The German government wanted to know how it was going. For a book about this, which includes those reports, look at Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning. Look at any actual book on the subject. Serious historians do not dispute this happened. Not all victims of Germany's rampage were shot dead. Many were deported from their hometowns and relocated into a network of concentration camps. Not just Jewish people were forced to these camps, but a whole slew of people who had ethnicities and beliefs the German government despised. Conditions in these camps were horrible. The German government purposefully created those conditions by refusing to treat inmates with diseases and by refusing to provide suitable amounts of food. But what's the proof of this? As the historian Nicholas Wachsman writes, there are literally tens of thousands of testimonies and studies and even more original documents on the subject. There's a whole book about this called KL. Even those denialists on the fringe admit disease and starvation were rampant in the camps, even though they were not rampant among normal German towns. Germany also extensively enslaved people it viewed as subhuman. Death by overwork was very common in Germany at the time. In fact, the main complaint German officials made about these mass killings, and you can see this in the reports, in the books that I cite, is that they were depleting slave labor. But Germany also industrialized its killing. Using carbon monoxide, Germany began to murder the disabled in late 1939 and early 1940. Why? It didn't view them as productive. It viewed them as genetic poison. This, of course, seems shockingly evil to us today, but such cruelty was the central point of fascism. The strong eat and the weak are meat. In early 1941, Germany began to mass murder those suffering the most in concentration camps because they were a burden. In autumn 1941, large numbers of Soviet prisoners of war, mostly regular conscripts according to German documents, arrived, and Germany began to mass murder them. To murder these Soviet prisoners, the concentration camp at Auschwitz, commanded by Rudolf Hess, pioneered the use of Zyklon B, a pesticide that killed through asphyxiation. Why use this method? Because it was easier and quicker than just shooting everyone. In summer 1942, Germany escalated its murder of Jewish Europeans. I say escalated because, as I talked about, Germany was already killing them, but beginning then, according to documents produced by the German government, it began to pursue complete annihilation of Jewish Europeans. I say Jewish Europeans because Germany imported Jewish people from its many puppet states for the purpose of murdering them. A lot of people have heard of Auschwitz, which was a massive concentration camp that also constructed an extermination facility. But that wasn't the only death camp. Germany built several. Using gas chambers and other methods of murder, Germany could kill many each day. To dispose of these bodies, German authorities constructed large industrial-sized crematoria, which had immensely increased capabilities from any regular crematorium. Even then, the bodies were commonly disposed by just burning them or burying them in mass graves. This historical fact is verified by the testimony of survivors, of witnesses, and German officials and grunts directly involved with the murder. By captured documents and communications. You can look them up yourself. Just Google the Posen speeches to start, or Joseph Goebbels' diary, or Hitler and Himmler's meeting on December 18th, 1941, or any other primary sources if you don't believe me. By using documents produced by Germany, including detailed reports by those who carried out the murder, we can estimate 6 million murdered among Jewish people and additional millions among other groups. This is historical fact. In sum, Germany killed roughly 10 million people from Soviet lands, including Jewish people, through a variety of means, including starvation, gunshot, and gas chamber. So, Zoomer Historian is incorrect that Germany did not begin to implement its plans of mass murder. It did. Millions died. He absolutely and completely fails to mention this at all, on purpose. As I've discussed, the SS, the Protection Squad, had a major role to play in the immense massacres Germany perpetrated in Eastern Europe. The Einsatzgruppen, or the deployment squads, spearheaded the execution of Polish intellectuals, of communist officials, of Slavic and Jewish civilians totaling in the millions. These were ordered by Hitler and Himmler. A few minutes ago, I literally read you Heinrich Himmler's speech saying that was what they were doing. So how does Zoomer Historian confront this in his hour-long video on the SS? Because that's his most popular video with 221,000 views, a large portion of which will probably keep watching to the end. For most of the video, he focuses exclusively on the high-level politics of the SS, its feuds, its leadership, so on. The only section where he discusses anything notably bad the SS did is his section on the Criminal Division, an SS brigade led by the convicted pervert, that's true, a convicted pervert, Oskar Derlewanger. After some time in Poland, Derlewanger and his men joined the invasion of the Soviet Union. They tore through villages, much like other units, including the police brigades and deployment squads I mentioned earlier. When Warsaw rebelled against Germany in 1944, Derlewanger and his gang played a key role in putting down the revolt, using extremely brutal tactics just like they did in Russia. If you want a book on the subject, the most prominent one I found was The Cruel Hunters, which I've linked below. Zoomer Historian mentions that he deserves credit for it, but what's the problem then? Here's what he says after detailing the crimes committed by the Derlewanger Brigade of the SS.
Much would be made of the Dirlewanger Brigade after the war, especially at Nuremberg, where the victors tried to paint the entire Waffen-SS as being like this. This couldn't be further from the truth, however. Every army has extreme elements. In Italy, Allied colonial soldiers went on an absolute frenzy of sexual crimes against the locals, and the British RAF turned thousands of women and children into dust in a single evening in Dresden. The Soviet sexual crimes on the Eastern Front were absolutely endemic. In the German armed forces, however, those that were caught committing these crimes were executed, and whilst not perfectly enforced, it was enforced the vast majority of the time. The reality is that the majority of soldiers on all sides wouldn't have been able to commit these crimes, and the image of the Waffen-SS being fanatics who would kill women and children like it was nothing is simply not true. The Dirlewanger Brigade, however, was a special case, and they did commit unspeakable crimes, which I'll probably cover in a separate video on the brigade's history one day, but even accounting for wartime inflations of the numbers or propaganda, this was one of the worst units of the war.
Okay, so this is the usual Zoomer historian strategy. 1. Concede that maybe the Germans did something bad. 2. Minimize it by saying it was just a one-time thing as a little treat. And 3. That everybody else did it worse or first. Was the Dirlewanger division particularly bad? Yeah, kinda. Were they alone? No. Hitler gave Dirlewanger the Knight's Cross for what he did to Warsaw. Hitler! Zoomer historian says war criminals were executed by Nazi Germany, but I have no idea in the least what he's talking about in reference to this at least, because war crime was the central strategy used against the civilian population of the countries Germany conquered. Germany had a systematic strategy of brutality. The deployment squads and the recruited police battalions did the same thing as Dirlewanger across Eastern Europe. Again, check out the book Ordinary Men to see this. There are literally pictures of German units mass executing Jewish women. Now, the Dirlewanger division was filled by criminal sadists and thugs, so how on earth could regular police battalions do this? Well, as I mentioned, they were inculcated with immense quantities of propaganda, including from the mouth of Hitler, that the people they were killing were beneath them, beneath human, Untermensch. Throughout the book Ordinary Men, the author details how the SS and the police made sure that its goons were completely alright with the mass murder they were committing. In one order you can find on page 14, for example, it reads, "The battalion and company commanders are especially to provide for the spiritual care of the men who participate in this action." The action, of course, being the execution of Jewish plunderers. The impressions of the day are to be blotted out through the holding of social events in the evening. Furthermore, the men are to be instructed continuously about the political necessity of the measures. Those social events, by the way, usually had plenty of alcohol. When men, for example, got sick from all the executing people, they were allowed to stand to the side, they could take a break. So, that's the difference between what Germany did and what the Western Allies did. Besides scale, Germany annihilated plenty of cities to match the firebombing of Dresden. The murder of civilians was the point. Anyway, at the end of the video, soon after admitting the Dirlewanger Brigade did bad things, Zoomer historian plunges into a multi-minute long tirade about all the bad things the Allies did to balance it out. He adds,
On the 23rd of April, 1945, Himmler made a statement during one of these peace negotiations via Sweden. "We Germans must declare ourselves as beaten by the Western Allies. That is what I request you, through the Swedish government, to convey to General Eisenhower, so that any further senseless fighting and unnecessary bloodshed might be spared. To the Russians, it is impossible for us Germans, and above all for me, to capitulate. We will continue to fight there until the Western Allied front has, so to speak, relieved the German fighting front." End quote. This message would fall on deaf ears. General Eisenhower had no intention of doing such things, and a few months later, he would personally orchestrate a genocide of 1 million surrendering Germans in the Rhine Meadows camps.
Okay, so this shows that Himmler, at the end of the war, wanted the Allies to stop fighting Germany and instead join Germany in war against the Soviet Union. You can read more about this in the last chapters of William Scherer's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. The German leaders were basically delusional. Oh, and by the way, Hitler fired Himmler for that. What about the Rhine Meadows camps? Did 1 million Germans really die there? At the time, nobody said this number. Instead, it was popularized by James Back in his 1989 book, Other Losses, where he basically extrapolates percentages from misreading reports. The title of his book comes from US Army reports that categorize people who left camps for strange reasons as other losses. He says they all starved to death. except other losses actually included people discharged from the camps because they were no longer a threat, including the children and elderly people that Hitler used as soldiers at the end of the Reich, as well as soldiers who were transferred to France and Britain to use as laborers. So, 1 million people did not die in those camps. But was there a severe food shortage? Yes, all across Europe, and thousands of people in Allied camps did die from starvation, but not hundreds of thousands, and not over 1 million. That's just bogus. Basically, every real historian agrees with this, and I've cited a couple of them on the topic. Okay, so knowing what we know about Zoomer historians' views about whether or not Germany persecuted Jewish people, let's look to the only video of his that actually addresses the subject head-on, Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, his 50-second video. Oh, and let's pretend you are a teenager who stumbled across the video without much background knowledge on the subject. In case that describes you, the Night of Broken Glass refers to what amounted to a state-sanctioned rampage against Jewish Germans that began on the night of November 9th to 10th, 1938. This was not the first blood spilled by the National Socialists that ruled Germany, but it was a major moment in the ramping up of violence toward the murder of millions. Martin Gilbert, who is one of my sources on this, subtitles his book on the subject, Prelude to Destruction. So, what happened? Gilbert calls it a coordinated, comprehensive rampage. German paramilitary forces of the Storm Division and others ransacked and destroyed thousands of synagogues, Jewish homes, Jewish businesses. Jewish people themselves were lynched too, 91 killed in the first 24 hours. 20 or 30,000 Jewish men were also rounded up and sent to concentration camps. While those weren't the death camps that Germany constructed later, many of those people soon died from abuse or purposeful neglect. Gilbert says more than 1,000. All of this is not disputed by any serious historian. At the time, foreign journalists were still in Germany and documented all of this. Zoomer historian also does not dispute that something bad happened, judging from his description. As he says, his video's purpose is to contextualize the violence. Now, there are a few problems right off the bat with his video. He says,
Hitler had spent years talking about the Jewish people, yet when he came to power, the actual repression against them was so mild that it disappointed some of the more radical corners of the party. Hitler had actually quite logically decided that if he was going to separate the Jews from the Germans, he wanted it done without causing a gigantic international uproar. After all, one of his biggest enemies was the foreign press, especially the Jewish-owned ones, and if he made any move too harsh on the Jews, they could quite easily ruin his reputation and make foreign policy an impossible minefield to maneuver. He set about doing this by actually working with Zionist organizations.
Okay, so I'm going to fast forward. He discusses how Hitler wanted to deport Jewish people to Palestine. Then he says,
Of course, in everyday society, there was shops who refused Jews entry and had signs saying Jews not wanted, but this was the case in the United States, or even Great Britain too, albeit not on the same scale, obviously. This was the situation in 1938, as the events of Kristallnacht neared. Hitler was viewed by some in the party as being too soft, as opposed to too harsh, despite his increasing restrictions on Jews. But the outside world, of course, viewed Hitler's rhetoric against the Jews as abominable. It was this minefield that the Führer had to navigate.
Okay, so let's confront how this is framed. The only thing he mentions the government actually doing is working with Zionist organizations to relocate Jewish people to Palestine. What that means in truth is that Germany just wanted its Jewish citizens to leave no matter what. Later, Zoomer historian says that Hitler took a tougher and tougher line on Jewish Germans in 1938, but you know what, that's pretty vague. What does that actually mean? Without any other background knowledge, would you assume Germany had implemented any actual anti-Semitic policies before Kristallnacht? Even if you assume they did, they did. Again, the video makes it seem like they were mild. So what actually happened? Well, let's look to the book, The Twisted Road to Auschwitz by Karl A. Schlunis. There's a whole chapter on this called Legislation. On their rise to power, the National Socialists frequently lynched and attacked Jewish people themselves, so there was already blood. They also promoted a boycott of Jewish-owned businesses. Elsewhere, Zoomer historian complains a whole bunch that Jewish people boycotted German products. Once they seized power in 1933, the Nazis began to implement anti-Semitic laws. First, they kicked Jewish people out of the civil service and the legal profession. Soon they restricted the number of Jewish people allowed in schools. They passed dozens of more laws. Germany stripped citizenship from around 150,000 Jewish immigrants, for example, that ultimately prevented them from being able to enter another country easily. Joseph Goebbels, the head of the propaganda ministry, blocked Jewish people from the arts, too. After a lull in 1934 and 1935, Germany enacted the Nuremberg Laws, which prohibited marriage and intercourse between anyone partially Jewish and anyone ethnically German. Now, Zoomer Historian is right that Hitler was very concerned with how the international community viewed his country. Before the 1936 Olympic Games, for example, Germany didn't implement any major new anti-Semitic policies. The way Zoomer Historian presents this, of course, is putting all the blame on Jewish people, because remember what he said?
After all, one of his biggest enemies was the foreign press, especially the Jewish-owned ones, and if he made any move too harsh on the Jews, they could quite easily ruin his reputation and make foreign policy an impossible minefield to maneuver.
Okay, so let's do some textual analysis here. Who has agency in that statement? The Jewish-owned press, who could ruin his reputation. Why is Hitler not ruining his own reputation by implementing these laws that newspapers just report on? Because remember, Hitler is dictator at this point. These laws are his laws. Anyway, in the year before the Night of Broken Glass, Germany continued to implement laws that essentially banned Jewish people from public life. So while Germany's anti-Semitic laws might have been mild in the eyes of bloodthirsty radicals who didn't need to conduct foreign policy, they were not mild in and of themselves. Oh, also, remember how Zoomer Historian says,
Of course, in everyday society, there was shops who refused Jews entry and had signs saying Jews not wanted, but this was the case in the United States, or even Great Britain too, albeit not on the same scale, obviously.
Was anti-Semitism a problem in the United States and Britain? Yes. But there was nothing compared to the large-scale national laws implemented by Germany. You could argue America's discrimination against African Americans falls into this category, and you know what? I'd agree. Both were horrible. But let's fast forward through his video. After his usual bit about Churchill actually being responsible for rising tensions, I'll address that later, Zoomer Historian begins a section of his video called Jews on the Move. Okay, title aside, he rightfully and correctly says that many Jewish people attempted to flee Germany, driven by Hitler's tougher and tougher policies. He also points out Germany deported many. He points out how other countries in Europe, hardly without their own anti-Semitism, rejected many of those, so he does deserve credit for that. Zoomer Historian also discusses the inciting incident, the assassination of a German embassy worker by a Jewish refugee soon before an important Nazi anniversary. This enraged people in Germany, but here's how he describes it.
Patriotic feeling was at a maximum, and the German people were never going to be in a position to tolerate such a targeted attack. The reaction was spontaneous and immediate. Within hours, synagogues were on fire across Germany.
Again, so you see how this is framed so passively? This is not so bad on its own, but if you watch the video, you'll see that he spent the past few minutes on the assassin, his life, why he did what he did, who he killed, how disgusting he was, so on. Now, when the large-scale violence occurs, he abstracts it and removes any actual people. Synagogues were on fire across Germany. Why didn't he just say the reaction was spontaneous and immediate? Nazis and their supporters began to burn synagogues. Because that's the difference between the Twin Towers were hit by planes and Al-Qaeda attacked the Twin Towers. You might not have noticed it, but your brain did. I won't spend too much time on textual analysis though, let's just keep going.
In fact, such events were occurring all over Germany before the Führer even received the news. Here, he ordered that no counter-protests should be arranged, and he was informed that the Munich police were already cracking down on huge anti-Jewish demonstrations. Goebbels, on the other hand, who was currently in disgrace with Hitler over his high-profile cheating scandal, had a bright idea to get back into Hitler's good books. The greatest public speaker Germany had, the very face of the public regime, made the pogroms his own cause. He told party officials to organise and fan the flames of the current spontaneous demonstrations. The SA was his vehicle for doing so, and plainclothed men quickly began making things worse, whilst also trying to make it seem as if the party was not responsible.
Okay, do you see the tactic here? He's removing all responsibility from Hitler, the Führer, the guy in charge, and putting it on Goebbels. Just a quick question. What do you think Hitler did in reaction to the report that Munich police were cracking down on huge anti-Jewish demonstrations? It sounds like nothing, like he supported the police even. Well, let's track down where Zoomer Historian got that information. David Irving's Warpath. On page 140, Irving writes, news arrived that the Munich police were cracking down on anti-Jewish demonstrations. So Hitler was definitely informed. But you know what Irving writes in the next paragraph? Goebbels wrote in his diary that Hitler told him, allow the demonstrations to continue, hold back the police, the Jews must be given a taste of the public anger for a change. It was then that Goebbels gave a speech communicating that exact message, which riled everybody up. Historian Richard Evans has a fuller version. Goebbels actually wrote, "Big demonstrations against the Jews in Kassel and Dessau, synagogues set on fire, and businesses demolished. The death of the German diplomat, von Rath, is reported in the afternoon. But now the goose is cooked. I go to the party reception in the old town hall. Colossal activity. I brief the Führer about the matter. He orders, let the demonstrations go on, withdraw the police. The Jews must for once feel the people's fury." That is right. Anyway, Irving doesn't trust Goebbels' personal diary that Hitler actually said this, but other historians, including Gilbert in the Kristallnacht book I mentioned, and Richard Evans in a book called Telling Lies About Hitler, have more confidence that Hitler gave the order. Zoomer Historian makes absolutely no mention of the greater number of historians who believe Hitler told Goebbels to pull back the police. He presents it like it's agreed upon history that Goebbels acted on his own. What does Zoomer Historian say about what happens next?
Hitler was with Himmler, and Himmler began to receive reports from his Gestapo that Goebbels' propaganda offices were whipping up anti-Jewish demonstrations, and that he was ordering the police, who were meant to be under the control of Himmler, not to intervene. Himmler turned straight to the Führer for further instructions, and he was ordered to protect Jewish lives and Jewish property. According to Himmler, it appeared as if this was the first Hitler had heard of such things when he told him.
Okay, so Zoomer Historian and the author he cites, Irving, want to move blame from Hitler and Himmler to pin it on a bad apple, Goebbels. Now, it's a bit fuzzy what actually happened, that's true. It's partially a question of whether you believe Goebbels, who said Hitler told him, or Himmler, who, according to Irving, says in his diary that, "When I asked the Führer about it, I had the impression that he did not know anything about these events," referring to the eruption of violence, presumably. There's a million different reasons why Himmler could get that impression. Maybe Hitler was playing dumb. Maybe Hitler was surprised about the scope of the violence. Maybe Goebbels did lie. Or maybe Irving mistranslated again. Anyways, check out this source for more on how Irving twists his sources around. Okay, so what do we know about what Hitler actually did? Certainly Hitler gave no public call for police to stop any demonstrations, except counter-demonstrations. He also spent the previous decade issuing anti-Semitic diatribes. Speaking of context, after the violence, Irving even says that Hitler chose to be photographed with Goebbels multiple times, a post-facto endorsement, he concedes. Zoomer Historian does talk about that to give him credit. So, does it make sense for Hitler to give such an order? I'd say so. Now, this is not to say that everyone in Germany was a puppet controlled by Hitler. Those who committed violence chose to do so, including men in government. How about Himmler, who Irving and Zoomer Historian cast as opposed to Kristallnacht, since it would embarrass Germany? Well, beforehand, Himmler gave a speech to his SS leaders. In Germany, the Jew cannot hold out. This is a question of years. We will drive them out more and more with an unexampled ruthlessness. I found this in Peter Padfield's book on Himmler, but it's also in John Toland's book on Hitler on page 503, which Zoomer Historian cites. Toland goes on to say, if Himmler objected to the terrorism sweeping the country, his chief assistant did everything he could to capitalize on it. Soon after midnight, Heydrich, that's Reinhard Heydrich, sent urgent teletypes to all headquarters and stations of the SD and police, enjoining them to cooperate with the party and SS leaders in organizing demonstrations. Again, organizing demonstrations. That sounds a bit like instigation. Sounds a bit like it wasn't just Goebbels. Before Heydrich sent out his orders, Heinrich Müller of the Gestapo, which was also controlled by Himmler, issued a nationwide order for no one to interfere with the demonstrations. While it called for the suppression of looting and other excesses, it also ordered for the preparation of the arrest of 20 to 30,000 Jewish people. Zoomer Historian doesn't mention that. Those men were soon moved to concentration camps and a lot of them died. The Gestapo order also said looting was to be stopped, but destruction and arson was alright. Businesses and dwellings of Jews should only be destroyed, not plundered. Later in the video, Zoomer Historian says,
in fact, by 1 a.m. that same evening, the synagogue next to Hitler's hotel was on fire, and his adjutant was called to come and collect his belongings in case the fire spread. The attacks continued into the night, and Hitler barely got any sleep. Still into the early morning, he was demanding to know what was going on, and was demanding that party officials put a stop to it now. At 3 a.m., Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, sent out a message to all the Gauleiters, quote, on express orders issued at the highest level of all, there is to be no arson or the like, whatever, under any circumstances, against Jewish businesses, end quote.
So, did Hitler try to stop the arson? Well, he might have. But why? it seems very likely he was worried about fires spreading and hurting non-Jewish businesses. That order issued by Heydrich I mentioned before, for example, reads, "Only such measures should be taken as will not endanger German life or property, i.e. synagogue burnings, only if there is no fire danger to the surroundings." Zoomer Historian kinda mentions this. He points out that rioters burned down a building near Hitler, but frames it like Hitler was just then learning about arson, rather than panicking about the risk of fire spreading to hurt non-Jews. If we trust Goebbels' personal diary, Hitler knew about synagogues being burned down from the start. But Zoomer Historian states more confidently that Hitler tried to stop the violence, which is obviously not true. If you want a whole chapter on how Irving, and by extension Zoomer Historian, distorts this whole thing, there's one in Telling Lies About Hitler. So, Kristallnacht was not exclusively some spontaneous demonstration. It wasn't engineered solely by Goebbels. The German government, including its dictator, approved of what happened and only sought to limit it to prevent harm to non-Jewish people and maybe Germany's image abroad. The rest of the video is fine. Zoomer Historian talks about how Kristallnacht was barbaric, how dozens of people died, and how it ruined Germany's reputation. He deserves credit for that, so I'll give it to him. Now, just a small additional note to close out this section. William Scherer, author of The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, who was in Germany at the time, points out that the destruction of Jewish businesses threatened to bankrupt the German insurance industry. That might have been in the minds of the German leaders that night, but I haven't seen much research on that, so I don't know. Anyways, if the insurance wasn't paid, nobody would trust the German insurance companies anymore, so big problem. Hermann Göring soon came up with a solution. The insurance companies would pay for the destruction, but the money would then be confiscated from Jewish people by the German government, with the companies partially refunded. Not only that, of course, but Germany also forced Jewish people to pay a collective fine, the Jewish capital levy, for the murder of the embassy worker. So, not only did the German government instigate the destruction of thousands of Jewish businesses and synagogues, not only did they instigate the murder of dozens of innocent civilians, but they also charged them for it. Another reason why the German government might have tried to keep the lid on the most fiery aspects of Kristallnacht was that it was in the midst of absorbing Czechoslovakia. Zoomer Historian has a couple of videos on this, but I'll focus on his video that is exclusively on the subject, Why did Germany invade the rest of Czechoslovakia? Because if you remember your history classes, Germany basically strong-armed the Czechs into handing over their border regions, inhabited mostly by Germans, that were necessary for the defense of Czechoslovakia. Britain, unwilling to start a world war over the Czechs, basically rubber-stamped this with the Munich Agreement. That was in the first 2 weeks of October 1938, but Hitler obviously wasn't satisfied, because on October 21st, 1938, Hitler issued the following orders. The future tasks of the armed forces and the preparations for the conduct of war resulting from these tasks will be laid down by me in a later directive. Until this directive comes into force, the armed forces must be prepared at all times for the following eventualities. 1. The securing of the frontiers of Germany, and 2. The liquidation of the remainder of Czechoslovakia. It must be possible to smash at any time the remainder of Czechoslovakia if her policy should become hostile toward Germany. Now, if you were an alien dropped from outer space, that might not sound so bad if Czechoslovakia should become hostile. But as you'll see, Hitler's standards for hostile meant anything not completely subservient to Germany. So even though Hitler secured the German parts of Czechoslovakia, he wanted to dominate the Czech parts too. What does Zoomer Historian say about this?
A.J.P. Taylor calls these, quote, measures of precaution, not plans of aggression, end quote. And he continued on, quote, these directives have often been quotes as proof that Hitler was never sincere in accepting the Munich Agreement. The truth is rather that Hitler doubted whether the settlement would work. Though often regarded as politically ignorant, he understood better than other European statesmen the problem of Bohemia and believed, without sinister intention, that independent Czechoslovakia would not survive when deprived of her natural frontiers and with Czech prestige broken.
Now, A.J.P. Taylor can say whatever he wants, but other historians have much different views. I've already cited William Scherer, a journalist in Germany at the time who believed Hitler was preparing for a follow-up war with Czechoslovakia. But let's look to another esteemed historian of Nazi Germany, Richard Evans, who in the chapter on Czechoslovakia and the Third Reich in Power argues the guy was itching for a war only to have his dinner swept away at the last moment by the Munich Agreement. The guy, after all, was hosting military marches at the time. Hitler had plenty of reasons to invade Czechia, including seizing the rest of its industries and putting pressure on Poland to surrender its German areas. Germany soon did all of that in real life. Since sometimes we're misled by too much context, let's extract this scenario and apply it to something today. Let's say that Mexico had a much larger army than the US. It bullies America for months about the Hispanic population of the Southwest, demanding the US surrender those territories. Since the US Army is tiny in this scenario, it relies on an alliance with the EU for protection, but soon the EU meets with Mexico and agrees that the US should turn over its land in exchange for peace. Mexico invades and occupies border regions. It agrees not to invade the rest of America, but it also bans the use of English in those areas. Germany did that to the Sudeten Czechs, except with Czech, not English, obviously. A week afterward, the dictator of Mexico writes an order to his army to be ready for war if America is in any way hostile. Oh, and that's not even mentioning the persecution of Jewish people and leftists in the Sudetenland that Germany immediately began. So that's the scenario we're handling here. Now, Zoomer Historian does explain how Germany was responsible for exacerbating tensions with Czechoslovakia in the early months of 1939, including supporting Slovak independence. With the crisis reaching a fever pitch, Hitler met with the Czech president and strong-armed him into submission with threat of military force. Czechia and Slovakia, separated, both became puppet states of Germany. As you can imagine, German rule in Czechia was typical. Thousands were arrested for their beliefs, or in the case of the local Jewish population, their ancestry. As elsewhere in the Third Reich, Jewish Czechs suffered from humiliation, enslavement, relocation to concentration camps, and ultimately mass murder. Much of this brutality was overseen by Reinhard Heydrich, one of the Nazi leaders most committed to the complete murder of Jewish Europeans. Let's see how Zoomer Historian talks about his rule over Czechia.
Many Czechs grew to love the prosperity from the occupation. During the war, this was so alarming that it was driving Beneš and Churchill insane. It flew in the face of all their propaganda that Reinhard Heydrich, the then protector of Bohemia and Moravia, was so loved by the Czechs. This was meant to be the devil incarnate, Heinrich Himmler's top guy, but regardless, the Czechs were pretty happy. He introduced revolutionary new social security and pension schemes, and they saw never-before-seen prosperity. The Allies simply couldn't accept this, and as we know, they sent assassins to kill him. 30,000 Czechs immediately demonstrated against his murder in the main square in Prague, but it was too late. The assassination worked, and Hitler brutally responded in Lidice. This heavy price meant no other top Nazis would be assassinated in this way, as most leaders simply wouldn't be able to stomach such blowback.
Okay, so was Nazi rule in Czechia popular? This claim comes from David Irving's Warpath, basically word for word. Well, believe it or not, Nazi Germany, being a totalitarian dictatorship, didn't take public opinion polls, so we can't really know for sure. But we can get a sense for how the Czech people liked being a German protectorate from Dreschner's biography of Heydrich, page 187. During the week from September 14th to 21st, in accordance with a call from London, the Czech protectorate press, which was under German supervision, was boycotted. The boycott was so widespread that more than half of the editions went back to their respective publishers. The resistance stiffened more and more. In fact, Heydrich was appointed to oversee Czechia because Germany was so unpopular. The reports which he received in Berlin transmitted to him the picture of a storm which was brewing over the protectorate. In a report from the office of the Reich Protectorate, there was also talk of preparation of rebellion and general strike slogans for 28 October 1941. But maybe Heydrich won the hearts of the Czechs. Well, this is actually a nuanced discussion. Heydrich used carrots and sticks. Since Germany relied on Czech industrial workers for its war machine, Heydrich won their submission by implementing social programs and giving them food, so literally carrots. But he also used the stick. Heydrich quickly wiped out resistance groups and crushed any disobedience. And he also began to evaluate the potential for the locals to be Germanized. Some could be, but as he stated, there are the others, the complete antithesis, bad racial stock and ill-disposed. Those are the people I have to get rid of. There's plenty of room to the east. If you remember, this number was evaluated to be roughly 50% in the general plan of the east. Heydrich also fantasized about using them to colonize the Arctic. This was to be done after Germany finished off the Jewish people of the continent. After Reinhard Heydrich was assassinated, did 30,000 Czechs demonstrate against his murder? This claim seems to come from Irving, but he doesn't cite any source in his book. Is it possible? Sure, but if you think honestly that 30,000 people just authentically, without any pressure or fear of reprisal, came to mourn their recently assassinated dictator, you're naive. At least Zoomer Historian mentions Germany's brutal response to the assassination, which resulted in lots of deaths, believe it or not. One last thing about his video.
But Churchill got his wish, and he was overjoyed with the deterioration in the Czech lands, which eventually led to the mass genocide of all Germans there at the end of the war.
Is this true? Were all the Germans who live in Czechia murdered after the war? No. Were they forcibly deported? Yes. Millions, nearly all of them. There's a whole book on this, which I've linked below. Now, this was not a clean process. As elsewhere in Europe, Soviet troops abused large numbers of women. The best research on this subject puts the number of Germans killed by Soviet soldiers and Czech people at somewhere between 14 and 22,000 people. After Hitler conquered Czechoslovakia, the next country that stood in his way was Poland. Now, Zoomer Historian doesn't have a video specifically dedicated to Poland, but he does talk about Poland in his videos on the outbreak of World War II. I'll go to his most popular one, The Complete History of the Outbreak of World War II, which is 2.5 hours long and has 68,000 views. After repeating his usual talking points about Czechoslovakia, he enters a prolonged section, beginning about an hour in, about German-Polish and Anglo-German relations in 1939. Now, Zoomer Historian points out how Poland was unwilling to make a deal with the Soviet Union or Germany, despite being stuck between two great powers. This is correct. Poland was kinda stuck between a rock and a hard place. But throughout this hour-long period in the video, Zoomer Historian never once explains why Poland might have rejected Germany's offer of non-aggression and alliance in exchange for Poland turning over the disputed city of Danzig. Because if you remember, just months earlier, Hitler played the same game with Czechoslovakia. He pressured the Czechs to turn over a disputed area, promised to leave them alone afterwards, and then invaded them. Can we possibly imagine that's why Poland refused any agreement with Germany? Can we imagine that? Anyways, as the tension grew over the course of 1939, here's what Zoomer Historian has to say about 2 hours in at the key moment of the whole video.
The Polish government had been given an option at the last moment to avoid war. The British felt the proposals were ridiculously mild. The Brits backed peace. The Poles chose the path of war. By choosing war, the Poles chose the destruction of Poland. They were living in a different reality than anyone else.
Who has agency in that statement? Who is actually doing anything? Well, the Poles, they're choosing war. They believe they could win. What about Germany? Who is the one actually invading Poland? It's really every single video like this where anything Germany does is always a reaction to the machinations or the plots or the plans of others, even when Germany invades a sovereign country. How much do you want to bet he does the same thing again?
The Poles genuinely believed they could win. Meanwhile, there was over 1 million Germans on Poland's border who knew all about the Polish massacres of ethnic Germans just miles away. Almost to a man, they were itching for revenge. There was no hope of this being a clean war. At 8 PM, Heydrich's infamous fake Polish attack at Gleiwitz took place.
See, there it is again. The false flag attack, which Germany used to justify the whole war, took place. It didn't just take place. Germany did a false flag attack. All the violence Germany perpetrated against Poland, the murder of millions, well, that's the fault of Poland, since it killed Germans beforehand. Apparently, Zoomer Historian repeats that claim several times in this video, and in others too, but did Poland even do that? Were any German civilians killed in Poland before the war? Well, I was able to find this, a Nazi propaganda pamphlet that claimed Poland killed 58,000 Germans after Germany invaded. Now, that is also not true, because the only specific massacre took place in Bromberg, where several hundred Germans were lynched by Poles while Germany sieged their city. Obviously a horrible act of violence, but this was not before the war, and therefore cannot be used to justify an invasion of Poland. Irving, who Zoomer Historian basically paraphrases point by point again, says in his book on page 193, on August 11th, Hitler ordered the anti-Polish propaganda volume turned up 80% of its full volume. After months of maintaining a studied silence in the Nazi press about the Polish atrocities, that's in quotes and it should be, on the 16th, editors were secretly circularized. The time has come for the German press to abandon its reserve. Goebbels ordered Polish terrorist incidents, another quotation mark, moved from page 2 to page 1. Maybe we'll check with A.J.P. Taylor and Pat Buchanan's books, which are also cited by Zoomer Historian, but I can't find them mentioning anything about any crimes Poland committed against Germans before the war too. I even looked through Rossino's Hitler Strikes Poland, no examples either. So I looked into this further and deeper, and the worst thing I could find was the Polish group ZOKZ, which according to the book, The Orphans of Versailles harassed and intimidated Germans living in Poland after World War I. Now it is true that most of the Germans who lived in Poland when the country was created left the country by the time World War II started, but I found no evidence that those population reductions were because of massacres. They were doubtlessly driven by the instability and the racism of Poland, the usual sort of racism and intimidation you'd find in an Eastern European country in the 1920s and 1930s. Not any large-scale murder. If there was, I'd condemn it. There certainly was after the war, and I'll condemn that. It seems most likely to me that the whole claim is probably German propaganda. If you'd like an example of that propaganda, I've linked a whole book published by the German Foreign Office in 1940, but obviously don't trust it at face value. The next part of the video details Britain's decision to declare war on Germany and Germany's shock that Britain had the balls to actually do it. Now, Zoomer Historian has a bunch of videos attacking Churchill, attacking British foreign policy in this period, so on. I thought about going through and debunking the claims one by one, but you know what? I kind of agree. British foreign policy was stupid. Britain should not have declared war on Germany in 1939. It should have declared war on Germany in 1936, when the tiny German army reoccupied the Rhineland. It should have declared war on Germany in 1933, when Hitler rose to power. Together with France, Britain could have toppled Hitler and restored democracy in Germany, but nobody in either government had the balls to do it. And you can quote me on that. The world would have been a much better place if that had happened. But anyway, once the war began in 1939, was there a path to peace? What exactly did Germany want to do with Britain? Zoomer Historian discusses this subject in his video, The We'd All Be Speaking German Myth. Here's how he opens the video.
Many myths exist about the Second World War that have never gone away, even until this day. But perhaps the most prevalent of all, especially here in the United Kingdom, is the idea that if Hitler had had his way, we would all be speaking German, and the United Kingdom would become some kind of puppet, brutal dictatorship. This couldn't be further from the truth, however. If you take even the closest look under the surface, you will discover a very different reality. The fact of the matter is that Adolf Hitler had absolutely no intention of taking over the United Kingdom or implementing the German language there.
As evidence for this, he cites Mein Kampf, which was written 15 years before war between Britain and Germany started. Now, Mein Kampf is obviously a good source into Hitler's ideological outlook, but it is not a good source into his exact frame of mind in 1940. What does he say about Britain anyways, though? On page 333 he says, "Thus the English nation will have to be considered the most valuable ally in the world, as long as its leadership and the spirit of its broad masses justify us in expecting that brutality and perseverance which is determined to fight a battle once begun to a victorious end with every means and without consideration of time and sacrifices." It's certainly ironic that Hitler, so long before the war with Britain, could foresee what a tough fight they could put up. You can look at that quote and a few others, but basically Hitler wanted Britain to be his ally in the restoration of German power over the continent. Hitler did not plan to fight against Britain at first. His concerns were with conquering living space in the East. Zoomer Historian says this, and he's right. But what happened once the war began? That's kind of the important thing, right? Well, when it became clear that Britain wouldn't duck out of the war and make peace with Germany, Hitler and his officers drew their plans against the Isles. If you remember, Zoomer Historian said that if Hitler had his way, Britain would not be a brutal dictatorship. Well, believe it or not, Germany did draw up military plans for the invasion and occupation of Britain. The invasion, Operation Sea Lion, was absolutely a serious plan that Hitler was fully committed to. There are a million books about this. If you want a short recap, Schur's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich has a chapter on it. Basically, Hitler fully expected Britain to surrender after France fell. But certainly plenty in the German government, including the Führer and the men who'd be in charge of bringing Britain into line with the new order, the SS, did take it seriously. As Schur writes on page 762, the mountainous secret German military files leave no doubt that Hitler's plan was deadly serious, and that, though given to many hesitations, the Nazi dictator seriously intended to carry it out if there were any reasonable chance of success. Its ultimate fate was settled not by any lack of determination or effort, but by the fortunes of war, which now for the first time began to turn against him. So, if Germany conquered Britain, not very likely, but if, what would it have done? Well, on September 9th, Field Marshal Walter von Brockisch, the commander-in-chief of the German armed forces, that's a pretty high-ranking rank, issued the following order on the military government of England. Unless the local situation requires an exception, the able-bodied male population between the ages of 17 and 45 must be interned and deported to the mainland as quickly as possible. Harsh measures were also to be dished out to any resistance, including passive resistance. But that's not it. By August, the German security forces were already organizing special units who were to comb through Britain and arrest thousands of possible resistors. Besides politicians, the list also included writers and scholars like H.G. Wells. That's what Germany did to Poland, after all. Oh, and that's not even to mention the Jewish British population who would face extermination just the same as the other Jewish populations of Europe. Germany had its eyes on that population, counting there to be roughly 330,000 in the January 20th, 1942 Wannsee Protocol. So if Germany conquered Britain, you'd see what you saw elsewhere in Europe: terror and mass murder. Would Englishmen be forced to speak the German language? I don't know, it doesn't really seem like that was being planned for at the time, but I think the mass murder is worse, don't you? Now, admittedly, Britain could have just signed an armistice with Germany in 1940, but there's a reason they didn't. Besides the obvious fact that Germany started the war, if Germany dominated the entirety of continental Europe, then they could build up the resources needed to eventually force Britain into submission. There's a reason why Britain fought a generation of war against Napoleon, for example. Does anyone honestly believe that Hitler, who invaded country after country, would have been content with any conquest? After he conquered Russia, who would he turn to next? A Europe united by Hitler would be no true friend to Britain. Britain had a choice in 1940, even if it didn't really know it: be the subservient partner in an alliance with America or the puppet of Hitler. I know what I'd choose if I was Britain, but I'm not so sure about Zoomer Historian. On the topic of Britain, let's look to what Zoomer Historian says about the Blitz, the German bombing campaign against Britain, which killed tens of thousands of people. Here's what he says.
Adolf Hitler began to seek peace with the United Kingdom as he sat across the Channel. What was the point in fighting for either side anyway? Hitler made all kinds of offers to the British, but Winston Churchill, who as we discussed last time, was quite literally being paid to push for war with and destroy Germany, chose to fight on.
Alright, so this claim gets repeated over and over again whenever he's talking about Churchill. Sorry to get sidetracked, but here is another example from literally his first video.
During the interwar period, he fell into crippling debt. He sold forged copies of paintings by a dead French artist and other similar activities to get by, until one day, a shadowy group called The Focus, led by an Austrian-born banker named Sir Henry Strakosch, who moved to Britain after making a fortune in the South African gold mines, paid off Winston Churchill's debts one day, and began paying him massive sums of money to become a literal paid shill to push for war with Germany. Other members of the British and Commonwealth cabinets at the time were being paid by Strakosch. Even the Czech government was giving money to Strakosch to pay off these British ministers to overthrow Chamberlain and cause a war with Germany. In July 1938, a single payment alone was roughly £2 million through the Czech embassy.
Okay, so this is a conspiracy theory. What do we know is true? Well, Strakosch was friend to Churchill and a wealthy financier who worked in South Africa for some time. Before he was Prime Minister, Churchill fell into debt, and it seems Strakosch helped him out. Now, the claim is that Strakosch manipulated Churchill into opposing Germany. That was popularized by David Irving, who made sure to add in his book Churchill's War that Strakosch was a Jew born in Moravia, Czechoslovakia. Alright, well, there you go. If your Nazi senses aren't tingling, then they should be. Where does Irving find this information? Well, believe it or not, as usual, he provides no citation that Strakosch was actually Jewish. In fact, there is absolutely zero evidence that Strakosch was Jewish at all. The guy had his funeral in a Christian church. In fact, the earliest mention of Strakosch being Jewish seems to come from some source called Israelite Finance, Its Sinister Influence. So you can guess what that's about. But whatever, maybe he's Jewish, maybe he's not. Let's do a steelman of Zoomer Historian's argument that Strakosch had an undue and malevolent influence on Churchill's ideas and policy. Except there's no evidence for this. All we know is that this guy gave him some money. But maybe there's more info out there about the Focus, the group Strakosch was apparently a part of. Well, Irving says on page XVIII in Churchill's War that he received a diary that revealed to him that the Czech government was bribing members of the Focus, a group which continued to fete and finance Churchill until the outbreak of war. Throughout the book, he has a chapter that focuses on the focus called The Hired Help. Irving casts the focus as an anti-Nazi group pushing Britain to be tougher and tougher on Germany. This all sounds very, very spooky if you know absolutely nothing about how lobbying governments work. Is this corrupt? If Irving is being completely honest, which is not a given, yeah, you know what, that's corrupt. But welcome to Politics 101. Did getting money from anti-Nazi factions make Churchill illegitimate, malevolent, manipulative? Was the focus twisting him into making arguments he wouldn't otherwise? Well, if you know anything about Churchill, I don't really buy that. If you believe it, prove it. What did Churchill do differently because the focus or Strakosch or whoever gave him money, allegedly? Anyways, let's get back to the Blitz. Here's what Zoomer Historian says.
The British people, however, were beginning to grow weary of a war with no clear aim. Until now, there was a general agreement between the British and the Germans not to bomb population centres. Up until this point, Germany had followed this agreement to the letter. No bombs were dropped on British cities, and only military targets were hit. The British had mostly stuck to it, but did, however, bomb a few cities in the Ruhr. Winston was desperately looking for an opportunity to escalate the war. Charles de Gaulle had even found him in his garden, shaking his fist at the sky, screaming, "Why won't you come?" His opportunity came, however, on the 24th of August 1940, when the Germans missed one of their targets, an oil refinery near London. No one was killed, but Churchill had his pretext. He caused a storm, claiming the evil Germans had targeted British cities, and he sent for a, quote, savage attack on Berlin immediately.
Okay, so let's break down this point by point. First, did Churchill shake his fist at the sky and say, "Why won't you come?" Well, Irving writes on page 388 of his book, thus London was still not bombed. On Sunday, August 4th, de Gaulle found the PM on the lawn at Chequers, shaking his fist at the sky and shouting in strange fury, "So they won't come." Surely we can see the difference between that and what Zoomer Historian said. But even then, did Churchill want Germany to attack London? Well, even Irving, who is very anti-Churchill, observes earlier in the book on page 317, Hitler had made no attempt to bomb London, and the intercepted Luftwaffe signal suggested would not do so unless provoked. But to Churchill there seemed only one certain path to victory, and that was, he informed his old friend Field Marshal Smuts, that Hitler should attack, and in so doing, break his air weapon. Okay, so even if we do take this as proof of Churchill's entire war strategy, it's pretty clear that in that case, the idea was to draw Hitler to attack a heavily defended area to destroy his air force. Hardly a pretext for a savage attack. Okay, so let's look closer at the refinery bombing that Zoomer Historian says killed no one. Irving discusses this bombing, which took place on August 24th. He writes, one bomber overshot its target, oil tanks in Rochester, and its stick of bombs fell inside Greater London. Nobody was killed, but 100 people lost their homes in the working class East End. I personally find it hard to believe that hundreds of people could lose their homes, but not one person could die. But let's check out Patrick Bishop's Battle of Britain, a day-by-day chronicle. Oh wait, what's this? The same day. 250 kilo bombs fell on Portsmouth, hitting shops, factories, houses, and the naval dockyards. The raid inflicted more casualties on the ground than any single attack so far, with 104 killed and 237 injured. But alright, let's just keep reading. Bombs meant for the Thames Oil Storage Depot and Short's Aircraft Factory in Rochester fell on the city and at least 9 other London districts. In Bethnal Green, the bombs ignited fires. St. Giles Church in Cripplegate was damaged, and bombs also landed on Oxford Street department stores. 9 people were killed and 58 injured. Okay, so some sources, Irving, say no one died and there was only one plane, and other sources say that several people died, and it was obviously a couple planes. But people definitely died in Portsmouth, at least. Let's see what Zoomer Historian says next.
The target was to be civilians. 100 British bombers set off for Berlin that night and caused havoc in the first targeted civilian bombing between the British and the Germans. Hitler didn't respond. For weeks, the terror bombing of German cities continued. Night after night, planes would set off from England and deliberately target German cities and, most importantly, civilians. Hitler still did not respond.
Then he has the Luftwaffe ace comment that Hitler told him he didn't want to bomb London at all. So was Hitler merciful and Churchill a bloodthirsty warmonger? Well, let's turn to William Schur, who was in Germany at the time. Berlin was well defended by 2 great rings of anti-aircraft, and for 3 hours, while the visiting bombers droned above the clouds, which prevented the hundreds of searchlight batteries from picking them up, the flak fire was the most intense I had ever seen. but not a single plane was brought down. The British also dropped a few leaflets saying that the war which Hitler started will go on, and it will last as long as Hitler does. This was good propaganda, but the thud of exploding bombs was better. The RAF came over in greater force on the night of August 28th to 29th, and as I noted in my diary, for the first time killed Germans in the capital of the Reich. The official count was 10 killed and 29 wounded. The Nazi bigwigs were outraged. Goebbels, who had ordered the press to publish only a few lines on the first attack, now gave instructions to cry out at the brutality of the British flyers in attacking the defenseless women and children of Berlin. Most of the capital's dailies carried the same headline, "Cowardly British Attack." 2 nights later, after the third raid, the headlines read, "British air pirates over Berlin." The main effect of a week of constant British night bombings, I wrote in my diary on September 1st, has been to spread great disillusionment among the people and sow doubt in their minds. Actually, the bombings have not been very deadly. So it does seem that Hitler did not immediately retaliate against Britain for the bombing of Berlin, but Berlin was definitely not extensively damaged. Why? Well, earlier, Schurrer writes, Goering, reviewing the situation at Carenhall, his country showplace near Berlin, on the 19th, ordered that as soon as the weather improved, the Luftwaffe was to concentrate its attacks exclusively on the Royal Air Force. "We have reached the decisive period of the air war against England," he declared. "The vital task is the defeat of the enemy air force. Our first aim is to destroy the enemy's fighters." From August 24th to September 6th, the Germans sent over an average of 1,000 planes a day to achieve this end. For once, the Reich Marshal was right. The Battle of Britain had entered its decisive stage, though the RAF pilots, already strained from a month of flying several sorties a day, put up a valiant fight. The German preponderance in sheer numbers began to tell. So it seems to me that Hitler's motivation in not retaliating against London immediately wasn't any benevolence, but because his strategy of attacking the RAF was working. He finally changed course in early September, about a week or so after London. For a sense of his mood, in his speech on September 4th, he said, "When they declare they will increase their attacks on our cities, then we will raze their cities to the ground." Within days, the German Air Force killed hundreds and hundreds of civilians in gargantuan terror bombing raids. But this was ultimately a losing strategy. What does Zoomer Historian, a British guy by the way, have to say about this? Well, he compliments the stoic British people, then says,
The ugly truth comes out, however, when we discover how Winston Churchill made these people so stoic. If bombs are landing on your head, you need to feel like your nation is doing something to defend you. But in 1940, such technology was unreliable, and as former PM Stanley Baldwin put it, the bomber always gets through. To deal with this problem, and to give the appearance of fighting back, Winston Churchill ordered naval guns and other ineffective weapons to be set up around major cities undergoing bombing and to fire into the sky at the aircraft. There was one problem, however. These guns didn't work, and Churchill knew it. These were not anti-aircraft guns. The end result was that most of these shells simply came right back down to Earth, and almost none hit the planes. When all was said and done, around half of the British civilian casualties during the Blitz were in fact inflicted by their own side dropping massive shells on their head, purely for appearance's sake. Churchill couldn't care less. The British people rallied around him, and for all they knew, this was the Germans. But in reality, their own Prime Minister was butchering them for his own personal gain.
Is that true? Did Churchill do that? Well, in his comment, he says that James Holland accidentally admits this. Okay, let's not look to accidents, let's look to actual positive arguments. Let's go back to Zoomer Historian's first video, which repeats a similar claim. In those comments, he writes, "Simon Webb is where I got that information from. I believe he addresses your exact question in a follow-up video on his own. Thanks so much for the kind words." Okay, so let's look up Simon Webb, who has a YouTube channel and releases about 3 videos a day. Such hits include the efforts to eradicate Christianity in Britain and promote Islam as its replacement, and Hannibal, the young Carthaginian is to be played on television by a 70-year-old African-American. And the thumbnail, European history is once again recreated as a black enterprise. Nobody tell him that Carthage isn't in Europe. But okay, I found the video, The Blitz, Why the British Shelled Their Own Cities During World War II. He basically has the same claims as Zoomer Historian. In his article on History Hit, this guy points out several accidents where artillery shells landed on the ground and killed people. His argument is an accident though. Churchill allegedly knew that many of the shells had defective timing mechanisms. This meant that instead of exploding 10,000 feet overhead, they plunged to Earth and exploded there. Well, how many shells had defective timing mechanisms? He says, One expert working at Cambridge's Cavendish laboratory estimated that half the shells exploded at ground level and that they killed as many people as the German bombs. Well, he doesn't cite who exactly says, so let's look to his book, Secret Casualties of World War II. Alright, let's look for more detail. There he says, there has never been any dispute about the fact that more British civilians were killed by the artillery than German aircrew. The estimates range from perhaps 10% to as many as 50% of the deaths on the ground during air raids being the result of British forces rather than the Germans. This latter figure was one favored by the men working frantically on the development of the proximity fuse, which would ensure that the shells exploded only when it was near enough to an airplane to cause serious damage to it. A scientist working on this idea at Cavendish Laboratories calculated that half the time the fuses used in anti-aircraft shells were defective, and that as a result they might be killing at least as many people during an air raid as were dying from German bombs. Looking through his book, his only source is that scientist, Jack Allen. Now, Jack Allen was a physicist who worked on accelerometers on artillery shells. He did help develop proximity fuses, which are basically what they sound like, except obviously if they don't get close to a plane, they then rely on the regular timing mechanism fuse, in which case they would still go to the ground and blow up people, even though Simon Webb doesn't seem to notice that. Anyways, let's trust Simon Webb that Jack Allen produced a report that claimed 50% of all anti-aircraft shells fell to the earth and exploded, and didn't just explode at the wrong time in the air. Let's ignore the fact that AA shells were obviously much smaller than the type of bombs dropped by, bomber planes. Why wouldn't anyone try to fix the problem with the fuses? Was it only Jack Allen? Why wouldn't anyone else observe this? They did test those shells, Why are there no other reports of high rates of failure of these fuses? I've spent hours researching this and have found no other claims about this except for Simon Webb and Zoomer Historian. Why were there only a few dozen reports of anti-aircraft shells exploding on the ground? Surely if this was more common, and people could identify the difference between the shells and German bombs at least some of the time, there'd be hundreds or even thousands of such reports. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. This is an extraordinary claim with very, very thin proof. Could it be true? I suppose so. And then Simon Webb would be the greatest historian of the 21st century. I just don't buy it though. Okay, so we've addressed Zoomer Historian's videos which deny or downplay atrocities committed by Germany. Remember how lighthearted his condemnations are? Anyways, let's address a great act of violence that the Allies actually did. The firebombing of Dresden. Most of the video is fine. Zoomer Historian focuses on the suffering of thousands and thousands of civilians on the ground who were incendiary bombed by Allied planes. Truly horrific stuff. People burned to death. It's horrible. Plenty of comparisons can be made to the US bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You can go back and forth on the military necessity of firebombing Dresden. The Allies thought it was necessary, that's why they did it, but in the end, they did kill thousands and thousands of civilians, so I'm not going to spend too great of an effort defending them. As Zoomer Historian says,
when all was said and done, these were the figures. A month after the massacre, the Dresden police chief reported that over 200,000 dead bodies had been recovered from the ruins, not counting those where nothing was left, as they had been boiled into nothingness. The chief later updated his numbers to 250,000. The International Red Cross estimated that 275,000 died. Because of the sheer number of refugees in the city at the time, and how many bodies simply didn't exist anymore, many credible historians or others put the numbers at between 300,000 and 400,000 dead.
Is that true? Did hundreds of thousands of people die in the firebombing of Dresden? No. The number is definitely lower than 100,000. The high number, believe it or not, was invented by the Nazi government. Why not exaggerate? The number one historian who likes to use the bigger number is, believe it or not, Irving, except he had to defend his claims in court. In his 1996 book on Goebbels, he finally backed down and wrote, between 60 and 100,000 people were choked to death or burned alive. What about those sources Zoomer Historian mentioned, the Dresden police chief, for example? Except in actuality, the Dresden police force reported to Berlin in March 1945, 2 weeks after the bombing, that some 12,000 fallen recovered until now. What about the International Red Cross? Well, here's what it wrote. At Dresden, in the Russian zone, where 275,000 people were reported to have been killed during a bombing attack. That's it. There was no Red Cross investigation, they just relied on the German number. So, the numbers in the hundreds of thousands have no basis in actual fact or evidence. This isn't to say the Allied bombing of Dresden wasn't horrible. It was very horrible. But to exaggerate the numbers so much only serves to distract from the horror by relying on forgery. Then we talk about the number instead of people suffering. let's just take a glance at his video on how the Soviets treated German civilians in World War II. The thumbnail literally says pure evil. Now, okay, I'm not going to bother replaying the whole video for you. Zoomer Historian is absolutely right to condemn the crimes of the Soviet Union, which very much matched the violence, to a large degree, perpetrated by Hitler. Now, if you remember the Kristallnacht video, Zoomer Historian was very concerned with contextualizing what the Nazis did. In this video, he does not mention in the least the crimes perpetrated by Nazi Germany, probably because he thinks they didn't happen, but whatever. It's completely morally justified to condemn the Soviet Union for what it did to civilians after the war. Even with Germany's horrible crimes, it's never morally justified to take out revenge on people. That's all I have to say about the video. Stalin was bad, like Hitler. How about Zoomer Historian's video on the Morgenthau Plan? What was the Morgenthau Plan? Well, unlike Germany's plans, which called for millions of deaths and were actually implemented by the government, the Morgenthau Plan did not and was not. So, as the war was coming to an end, Henry Morgenthau Jr., the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, wrote what he thought should be done with post-war Germany in a memorandum. It should be the aim of the Allied forces to accomplish the complete demilitarization of Germany in the shortest possible period of time after surrender. This means complete disarming of the German army and people, the total destruction of the whole German armament industry, and the removal or destruction of other key industries which are basic to military strength. He talks about how Germany should be divided for some time and how the country needed to be denazified. In reference to the Ruhr area, the industrial heartland of Germany in the west, Morgenthau says, all industrial plants and equipment not destroyed by military action shall either be completely dismantled and removed from the area or completely destroyed. All equipment shall be removed from the mines, and the mines shall be thoroughly weakened. Here's pretty offensive part 2. All people within the area should be made to understand that this area will not again be allowed to become an industrial area. Accordingly, all people and their families within the area having special skills or technical abilities should be encouraged to migrate permanently from the area and should be as widely dispersed as possible. Later, among a list of several ways Germany should be made to pay reparations, he includes by forced German labor outside Germany. Basically, the plan was to make Germany a completely agricultural country, a potato patch. Okay, so obviously the Morgenthau Plan repeats the same mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles. We'll get into the bureaucratic history of the document, but let's see how Zoomer Historian describes it in his video, The Insane US Genocide Plan Against German Civilians in World War II.
Morgenthau got to work on convincing Roosevelt that this was the way to go, and putting him off the much more lenient plan from the State Department. Morgenthau said, quote, "We've got to be tough with Germany, and I mean the German people, not just the Nazis. We either have to castrate the German people, or you've got to treat them in such a manner that they can't go on creating people who want to continue the way they have in the past." Roosevelt was enthusiastically on board with the idea and promised to try and convince Churchill in Quebec. Stimson, the proponent of the State Department's plan, never stood a chance with Roosevelt. Morgenthau was deeply connected and was a huge donor to the Democratic Party. The plan pitched to Roosevelt went roughly as follows. Firstly, the mass murder of at least 50,000 German officers without a trial. The Ruhr, the industrial heartland of Germany, was to be totally stripped of all its industry. All metallurgical, chemical, and electrical industries in Germany as a whole were to be removed. Germany would be split up into several smaller states, as well as a huge international zone, which was effectively so the land could be milked for reparations for the various powers. This looted industry from Germany would go to the powers who had been invaded by the Nazis, presumably, since at least 7 different known Soviet agents had a hand in drafting this plan. This meant presumably the Soviet Union. And to top it all off, Stalin was to be allowed to use the German people as slave labor. As he marched into Germany, he would be allowed to take as many German people as he wanted and simply employ them as slaves. When asked what would happen with the surplus population after the industry was taken away, Morgenthau said that they would simply be dumped in the barren wasteland of North Africa.
Okay, so there are 2.5 additional claims made by Zoomer Historian, which I can't see at first in Morgenthau's memorandum. 1. 50,000 German officers were to be shot. 2. Surplus German population was to be allowed to wither or even actively exterminated. 3. Stalin could use German labor as extensively as he wanted to. In the comments, Zoomer Historian says that his source for the video is Stalin's War by Sean McMeekin. I could make a whole video on that book, but let's just focus on his chapter on the Morgenthau Plan, which Zoomer Historian basically follows sentence by sentence. Except not sentence by sentence, because McMeekin never actually says that Morgenthau actually proposed the US kill 50,000 German officers to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt never actually agreed to do that. If you remember, we looked at the actual plan. So did Morgenthau actually ever say anything about the 50,000 officers number? Well, if you look at the Morgenthau Diary for Germany, which was prepared by the Senate's Subcommittee to investigate the administration of the Internal Security Act and other internal security laws of the Committee on the Judiciary, yes, he did talk about it. I put a link in the description, but on page 26 it reads, regarding the punishment of Nazi leaders, White, that's Morgenthau's assistant, now suggested that a list of war criminals be prepared and presented to American officers on the spot who could properly identify the guilty and shoot them on sight. John Pele, the Treasury lawyer, remarked that this was a fine idea, but added, if anything is done, it has to be done right away, or nothing will be done. A recent study Pele had made on the treatment of war criminals in World War I revealed that after long delays, no action was taken. He suggested therefore that a list be drawn up to include individuals which everybody would agree ought to be shot. Morgenthau remarked, jokingly, that a good start could be made with Marshal Stalin's list of 50,000, a reference to Stalin's famous vodka toast to Roosevelt and Churchill at the Tehran Conference. So even Morgenthau, who despised Germany, did not seriously argue that the US should kill 50,000 guys. Just the ones that everyone could agree were war criminals, men like Himmler, Eichmann, so on, presumably. Now, doubtlessly this would get out of hand, which is why the US didn't do it. But even McMeekin, who hates Morgenthau as a communist, doesn't argue Morgenthau ever actually proposed this to Roosevelt. Zoomer Historian basically found the harshest history book he could find on Morgenthau, then misread it. So did Roosevelt ever seriously propose 50,000 officers should be shot? I'll let Zoomer Historian describe what he thinks at the beginning of his video.
At the Tehran Conference, Stalin first talked of dismembering Germany and then said to Churchill and Roosevelt that they should kill 50,000 German officers. Churchill, to pay him a compliment for once, found this abhorrent, so Stalin played it off as a joke. Roosevelt was all on board with Stalin. History has chosen to believe that Stalin was joking. They were wrong. Here's what really happened. This is part of the US plan to commit genocide against Germany after the war and end them as a country forever.
This again comes from Stalin's war, which also presents Roosevelt seriously wanting to execute 50,000 German officers. Well, what actually happened? Well, Charles Bolin, a State Department official observing the Tehran Conference, wrote that the most notable feature of the dinner was the attitude of Marshal Stalin toward the Prime Minister. Marshal Stalin lost no opportunity to get in a dig. Almost every remark he addressed to the Prime Minister contained some sharp edge, i.e., Stalin was poking at Churchill the whole dinner. When Stalin suggested 50,000 officers should be executed, the memorandum literally says, this is from someone who was in the room. The president jokingly said that he would put a figure of the German commanding staff which should be executed at 49,000 or more. This is what Zoomer Historian casts as all on board, people making harsh jokes about German officers and war criminals. It sounds brutish to us today maybe, but you have to remember these men were in the middle of the Second World War. Millions of people were dying. Since Zoomer Historian feels the need to engineer some allied genocide of Germany, Stalin's statement, which could have been a joke or could have been serious, and Roosevelt's flippant joke get treated absolutely seriously. Again, this was never official Allied policy. The US was never going to kill 50,000 Nazi officers, and we didn't. Let's move on to the next claim that Zoomer Historian makes, that the Morgenthau Plan would have resulted in the deaths of lots of Germans. In his video he says Morgenthau didn't care about the excess population of Germany, that they could be dumped in the barren wasteland of North Africa. Where does that come from? Well, when a diplomat named Francis Penrose argued that Morgenthau's plan could cause people to starve, Morgenthau exclaimed then that the excess population would be dumped into North Africa. Such a discussion was not worth pursuing. Okay, so this is at most a heartless, dismissive remark that reveals how Morgenthau hated the Germans for the support of National Socialism. But would deindustrializing Germany actually cause the deaths of people, of millions of people, as his thumbnail proclaims? Well, as far as I can tell, the 30 million number doesn't come from any actual analysis. It just comes from subtracting the pre-industrial population of Germany from the post-industrial population of Germany, which is obviously a very, very clumsy way to calculate possible deaths. Would dismantling the industries of the Ruhr have killed people? Well, certainly lots of people would be out of a job, and Germany would not have the resources it needed to purchase food because it relied on trading industrial goods. That would definitely exacerbate the food crisis that I mentioned earlier that Germany went through after the war. Would America have let millions of Germans starve? No. Morgenthau even notes that Roosevelt hoped to just feed them out of the American Army's soup kitchens. It is completely accurate that Morgenthau was not particularly concerned with whether or not Germans starved. Remember, Morgenthau, the whole Western world at this point, knows about the murder of millions of people in the gas chambers, let alone the destruction of Germany's conquest itself. It's heartless, unforgiving, definitely falls under the category of revenge. But even if you look at what happened in real life, when some German industries were actually repressed and Germany was confronted by the same food issues it saw during the war, the Allies did not let Germany starve. Believe it or not, there are plenty of books about this, including Agrarian Management in Post-War Germany, which I linked below, which show that the Allies went through great lengths to prevent mass starvation in Germany, even at a time when global demand for food was greater than supply. Was food supply in Germany a major issue? Yes. Did lots of people starve? Some to death? Yes. But the Allies did not engineer the famine. If you remember earlier, I talked about the hunger plan where Germany wanted to seize the agriculture of Ukraine to feed Germany. When it became clear that the industrial restrictions weren't working, the Allies changed track. I'm not even mentioning the Marshall Plan, the reconstruction of Germany, how Germany is now an American ally. We've got 1 point left in the Morgenthau Plan, forced labor. Now, the original Morgenthau Plan included this provision. Do we have any more specifics? Well, if you look at the Morgenthau diary, it reads, on April 10th, a top secret document over the signature of Josiah Du Bois, one of Morgenthau's guys, was circulated to the Departments of State, War, Navy, and the Foreign Economy Administration, containing suggested provisions to be appended to the reparations directive. Among these additions was the curious concept of human reparations, the idea that a large labor force to be supplied by the Germans to meet the claims of other countries for damages should be recruited primarily from Nazi groups, the Gestapo, SS organizations, officers of the Wehrmacht, and those elements of the population who have cooperated in financing and building up the Nazi machine. Now, White, another of Morgenthau's underlings, suggested that the Soviet Union would be justified in demanding German carpenters and plumbers to fix damaged infrastructure. But as far as I found, not even Morgenthau suggested the US use the compulsory labor of German civilians, just the men who caused and conducted the Second World War. You can make your own determinations though. So, did the US use slave labor in real life? First, the US used roughly 140,000 Axis prisoners of war as laborers, chiefly in agriculture, including small farms across the West. Was this slave labor? You could definitely make the case. But this was not the type of slave labor employed by Nazi Germany, which did not care if its prisoners lived and very frequently worked them to death or outright murdered them. There's nothing like that happening in America at the time. German prisoners of war were treated well in the United States. Camps were fully equipped with necessities to live, medical care, and even luxuries such as access to newspapers, cigarettes, so on. They were, however, paid very little. This is the unbiased truth. As a matter of absolute fact, the Allies treated their prisoners much better than the Axis, but they did use them as laborers. If you don't believe me, look into it yourself and comment below. This is a controversial thing, obviously, but it doesn't compare to what Zoomer Historian describes it as. Did the US enslave any German civilians? Nope. While Germans had to register for compulsory labor, I can find absolutely no evidence compulsory labor of civilians was ever enforced by the US. The Soviet Union did, of course, so that's worth condemning, but Morgenthau didn't give them permission, Morgenthau didn't greenlight them. But were America's actions in any way comparable to Nazi Germany? No. Okay, so this video is pretty long at this point. Let's get into a conclusion. Zoomer Historian is fake history. He basically follows the books of David Irving point by point, unquestioning, and at times exaggerates or gets the guy's claims wrong. Let's finally address the 400-pound denialist in the room, David Irving. The guy was at one point a historian, that's true. He definitely has a knack at finding obscure documents. But as I talked about in this video so far, he basically uses no citations, and if you do look at them, they're either unverifiable or don't even refer to pertinent statements. Here's what author Richard Evans writes in his book Telling Lies About Hitler, which is all about David Irving. John Lukács, an American historian who had written extensively on the Second World War, already declared in a review of one of Irving's books in 1981 that Mr. Irving's factual errors are beyond belief. Hitler's War, that's one of Zoomer Historian's main sources, contained many errors in names and dates. More importantly, unverifiable and unconvincing assertions abound. Many of the archival references in Irving's footnotes were inaccurate and did not prove or even refer to the pertinent statements in Irving's text. He convicted Irving of frequent twisting of documentary sources and urged considerable caution in their use by other historians. There's a number of specific examples in the book I've cited of Irving obviously manipulating documents that he's confident he only knows about, or trusting obvious Nazi propaganda without a shred of suspicion, or even exaggerating Nazi propaganda either on purpose or accident, then getting proved wrong when others find these documents. There are plenty of books and articles that cover this. When his lies were pointed out by Deborah Lipstadt, who rightfully pointed out that he denied the Holocaust occurred, he sued her in court for defamation and lost. Remember, these guys are English, and the law there is much stricter on defamation. Irving evidently has gone deeper and deeper down a rabbit hole of delusion. He started off as a self-proclaimed only truthful historian on Hitler, and nowadays seems to completely deny that Hitler did anything bad at all. It seems though that Irving continues to find new fans, including Zoomer Historian. So what does this all matter? Why watch such a long YouTube video? Well, speaking of watching YouTube videos, Zoomer Historian's gotten over 1 million views on his channel. That's not 1 million individuals, of course, but that's a lot of people who have been misled about the most important historical events of the last century. Certainly there are a lot of people who cheer him on too. Check out his Buy Me a Coffee, where people like that guy have given him plenty of cash. But Zoomer Historian is just one voice in an entire ecosystem of people whose ideas and beliefs are growing more popular. For example, a YouGov poll this past December showed that roughly 7% of US adults believed the Holocaust is a myth, including 1 in 5 people aged 18 to 29. Another poll from around then showed that around 15% of people, including 31% of people aged 18 to 29, believed that democracy is no longer a viable system and America should explore alternative forms of government to ensure stability and progress. Will this video help combat disinformation? I hope so. I hope people watch it and learn something. I hope people who disagree with me listen to what I have to say and change their minds in the face of better evidence. And to be honest, I hope YouTube doesn't demonetize this and suppress it, but in case they do, how about you check out my Patreon? For $1 a month you can get your name in the credits like user SEQ, Marklin, Sheba, and Dorothy Vivian. Thank you, and adios.